All right. Hello and welcome to Engineering Ethics at NJIT. This is the first video hangout that we are doing in the fall semester 2017. We didn't do one last week, and I apologize for that. Things were a little bit chaotic at the beginning of the semester. I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but I was assigned a course, section 451. I was assigned that course without knowing it just a few days before class started. And so in the first week, I was scrambling to get that last class set up, which explains the delays and also explains the confusion about the attendance credit. So I think I've corrected all of that. I'm not entirely caught up on grading. I haven't finished the grades from last night, the replies that were due last night. But I've done a lot of the grading. I think I've caught the courses up so that I'm on top of everything. The point of these Hangouts is to have some open discussion for the online sections. It's also to give some opportunity to interact with me and with your peers because you don't have that option as an online class. So I want to open it up to y'all. If you have questions about the course, about the assignment structure, about the syllabus, about the grading policies, anything like that, I'm here to answer those questions. Also, if you have questions about the lessons, the lesson plan, any of the readings, I'm happy to talk about that too. If we have time today, I'll go through some of the material from lesson 2 just to point to it and maybe introduce people to it if you haven't watched the lecture video already. But the lecture video is up on YouTube, it's up on Moodle already. And this is going to be the Hangout. I'm going to post this Hangout video immediately below the lecture video so that everyone will have the benefits of both videos. Okay, I'll stop talking there. Does anyone have any questions, anything you want to talk about? You can jump in on video chat. There's also a voice type chat, group chat that you can type in if you want to leave a question there and you don't want to come on video. If you're on video, you don't have to use your video stream if you don't want to. If you just want to leave a chat, that's fine.
I just wanted to say that I thought it was really cool that or not really cool, but really interesting that they were getting pressure from the president to launch. I didn't know that. Like, I knew a lot about just like the whole accident and everything, but I didn't know that they were getting pressure from Ronald Reagan, and they were like, hey, launch so that we have something to brag about. And that's like really scary. I can imagine like the managers or whatever, I'm sure the engineers didn't care, but the managers were like, okay, like time to move. Like, we got to stop delaying this and putting this off.
Yeah, very good. I really like that case from the Challenger explosion because it's not a financial incentive. So most of the examples that we'll get in class are when when someone stands to gain or lose a lot of money, and so it takes a risk and puts people's lives in danger for a financial incentive. But in this case, it's really not the financial motive. It's really a political motive. There's this political pressure from these powerful people, and that political pressure is enough to get people to make the wrong decision. So it's really fascinating. There's not a lot of examples like that in class. There might be a few more. We'll see some political meddling in the Deepwater Horizon case. But yeah, as you said, the important thing about these case studies is to think about how you would handle it if you were in that position. If the president was breathing down your neck, how would that affect your choices?
Yeah, and you mentioned, like, in the video, too, you were like, it wasn't a failure of the engineers. The engineers very much did not want to launch. And that guy, I thought it was really funny when you said, or when you were reading the Wikipedia page that said, like, he sent out, like, a email or memo or whatever that said help so that people would read it because it was so important. And he was like, seriously, I'm pretty sure people will die if this happens. And sure as hell they did.
Yeah, it's the Bob Ebeling was the engineer who wrote that memo, and he's also the one with the tragic case where he was guilt-ridden for 30 years afterwards. And in my live classes, we spend a lot of time talking about whether Bob could have done something different. He himself thought that maybe he could have done more. This is why he was racked with guilt. But was there anything that he could have done? What other options did he have? He wrote a memo. He tried to tell everyone that it was important. Right? He made his speech during that phone conference the night before the launch. What else could he have done?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I was just like, he basically did everything that he could have. Like, you know, he put his job on the line, basically, because everybody was getting upset with him. They were like, how could you even suggest that we keep putting it off? They were just like appalled that he would even suggest it. And he basically put his job on the line, and that wasn't enough.
Yeah, he did put his job on the line. He put his psychological well-being on the line too, right? He took it personally. Yeah, so I mean, he made a great sacrifice. Could he have done more though? Maybe not thinking about this in terms of blaming him for not having done more, but were there any other options available? So one of the things we came up in class with is he could have gone to the press. So he passed that memo around.
Oh, yeah.
He passed that memo around to Morton Thiokol engineers. He passed it around to the NASA engineers. But if he had gone public, especially if he had gone public before the launch and then it ended up exploding, it would have looked especially bad because, look, we knew about it. We very clearly knew about it. So maybe going public. Another thought that we have, and I don't remember exactly where I read this, but I think in one of the readings it talks about this, is that he could have also gone to the astronauts. So instead of making a big public spectacle of it, if he had gone to the astronauts and explained this situation, maybe the astronauts could have used their pool internally to delay the launch. I mean, if the astronauts tell you, look, I don't want to go through with it, then maybe you don't send them up into space. So maybe Ebeling did all that he could given his career, given the place where he is in his career, but maybe he could have gone to other people who were more influential. I mean, maybe he could have called the president. That's
probably why he feels guilty. He probably looks back on that and realizes, you know what, like I could have stopped these people from dying.
Yeah. It's a tragic case. One of the lessons from this case is that you have to live with the choices that you make.
Yeah.
And it's a hard thing to deal with, especially because sometimes the choices you make, you don't really think about them at the time, but they can have a huge impact on your life, on your choices. You know, I have a friend that hit someone drunk driving and has his license revoked and all sorts of problems in his life, that ongoing problems from having it was having failed to make the right decision at the time. It was because he didn't put enough thought in at the beginning, and now he has to live with these consequences. And that kind of thing can hang around your neck for 30 years. Yeah. Good. Excellent. If you have more to say about the Challenger explosion, if anyone else has anything to add, if anyone else wants to interrupt with any other questions or comments. I guess I'll say here that the hope is in the future that people show up to this with things to talk about. I'm very glad you did, Marissa. Thank you very much.
No problem.
That was lesson 2, right? I didn't read that yet.
Yeah, the hope is that people come to the Hangouts with things to talk about for this lesson. But that's okay. This is the first Hangout, and Marissa is just unusually prepared. It's very good. Let me go ahead and jump into the lesson, and maybe this will help stimulate some thoughts.
Is the quiz with like lesson 2 and then all the required readings, that's all incorporated into the quiz?
Lesson 2 are the required readings all incorporated in the quiz. Yeah, that's right. So here in lesson 2, I think I should be sharing my screen now. So I have, at the very end of the lesson, I have this little table. The stuff on the left is all stuff that will appear on the quiz, or that could appear on the quiz.
As well as the video above that, right?
Yeah, so the video is really just me introducing the readings. So I don't really say anything novel in the video. I just sort of go through the readings and give you a little preview of what's inside.
Okay.
Yeah, so the video is just supposed to be an introduction to the lesson to get you going. The way that I'm thinking about this is that the video is the lecture where I'm just talking to a camera for an hour. And then these Hangouts are supposed to be where we're having a little bit of a dialogue, hopefully where I don't say very much and students can have a dialogue if they show up. Again, another thing is that there's a secret word where you can get the attendance. For the online students, all attendance is extra credit, but there's a total of 5 points that you might earn per lesson. And so that's the attendance quiz down here. The way it works is that in the lecture, I'll say a secret word. The lecture secret word is worth, I believe it's worth 2 points. And then during this Hangout, I'll also say a different secret word. And that secret word will be worth 3 points. And those together will give you the 5 points per lesson of extra credit. It's extra credit. It's not mandatory. You don't have to get that credit. But it's a good way of buffering your scores if you're worried about your grades in the class. It's also pretty easy. The lecture and the Hangout will both be posted on Moodle, and you can turn in that attendance credit anytime until Friday at midnight. So you don't have to show up for this Hangout if you don't want to. You can still watch the video and get the credit for it afterwards. And I'll go ahead and say right now that the attendance secret word is water. Water, just like the password here. So if you put water in for the Hangout secret word, you'll get attendance credit for this week. Let me actually make sure that that's correct. Listen to secret word water. Oh, it's not set yet. I'll just change it right now. Okay, so those grades should be good. Those grades should be good now. Okay, so that's the attendance credit. Again, there's a lecture secret word. There's going to be a Hangout secret word. I've said both of those already. So you should be able to get attendance credit. And this will be a weekly thing. Every Wednesday, I'll be here at 12 o'clock. You can think about this kind of like office hours where you can ask questions. Hopefully, we can have some interesting conversations like we just had with Marissa. Good. Any other questions or comments about the course structure, course layout?
I kind of have a personal question just about you. I read, I think it was in your syllabus or something, that you went to school in UC Riverside for your undergrad.
Yeah, that's right.
Are you from California, or did you just
that's right.
to go to California?
No, I'm from California originally. I did graduate work in Illinois for a decade. But yeah, I'm originally from California.
Yeah, I'm from California too. That's why I asked.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, East Coast is different. Yeah, but I like it out here. Good. I did my undergrad in computer science. I got my degree in 2003. That was sort of right at the tail end of the dot-com boom, when a lot of people were getting computer science degrees. Yeah, but that was a long time ago. Computer science has changed since then quite a bit. All right, so good. There's a lot of material in Lesson 2. Some of it's pretty controversial. Our in-class sections got into some good debates, especially about the women in STEM stuff. We had a good discussion a while ago about the Challenger explosion. Let me emphasize just the Challenger explosion if you haven't looked at this yet. Challenger explosion is this rocket that exploded, and it was a preventable disaster. We knew about the problem before it happened, and we let it launch anyway. And part of what happened when it went through was this quote, and Love this quote. Yes, we were talking earlier about the political pressure from the president and so on. And that political pressure sort of manifests in this exchange. So the general manager of Morton Thiokol, the rocket contractor who's building these rockets, is talking to the VP of engineering. The VP of engineering is Bob Lund. VP of engineering, he's a manager. He's the manager in charge of engineering, but he's the one that's listening to all the engineers. And his engineers are telling him that there's this problem with these O-rings, that they're going to fail. And so as an engineer, he says that he recommends to postpone the launch. And during this meeting the night before the launch, he's getting all this pressure from the managers. The managers tell him, tell Bob Lund that he should stop thinking like an engineer and she should start thinking like a manager, to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. And this change in perspective, the change in perspective from the engineering perspective to the management perspective, it goes along with a change in values, a change in interests, a change in goals, and that makes the person change their decision, right? So the person, Bob Lund, the VP of engineering, was originally listening to his engineers and recommending postponement, but when the general manager tells him to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat, he ends up changing his decision, and they go through with the launch, and then a bunch of astronauts die. Yes, I mean, this change in perspective, this change in values, this is part of the theme of this course. What perspective we occupy, what values we're committed to. This can change in context to context and role to role, right? The values that I have when I'm a teacher talking to students is different from the values I have when I'm with friends at a bar. It's different again from the values I have when I'm with family at a holiday dinner. And the values change, the interests change, the perspective changes, and that means my actions change, my decisions change. What I do changes also. Does someone want to jump in?
I just think it's like scary almost that he was telling him like these values are not the values that should be important to you right now because we have these other bigger influences like the president telling us we need to do this, we need to hurry up. And I mean, these are just like my values, my feelings and opinions on the situation, but like I don't think that was right of him to say like, oh, stop letting these things be important to you when there's other bigger things, like the president telling, like he wasn't taking into consideration how important his opinion was as an engineer and his values as an engineer were.
Yeah, good. So I mean, one complication of this is that it's not like he was telling him ignore your values and listen to my values. Bob Lund was also a manager, right? He also shared those management values. In some sense, they were his values, but the engineering values were also his values. So, right. So these ethical dilemmas, it's not just a dilemma between choosing right from wrong. It's sometimes a dilemma of choosing between one set of values you have and another set of values you also have, mm-hmm. and those choices aren't very straightforward. I mean, we can understand in some sense why the political pressure matters, why someone would take that political pressure seriously, why that might influence someone's choices. You said a couple of times that this is scary. What in particular is it the susceptibility to someone changing their mind? Is it the fact that people can pressure?
I think it's scary because, like, yeah, like you said, like he was choosing between one set of values that he has and another set of values that he has that were like applied to different scenarios and different people. But I feel like the consequences of going through with it only really like conflicted heavily with the set of values that he carried as an engineer, because he, like you said, he was also a manager, and if they didn't carry out the launch, then yeah, a bunch of people would have been like upset and would have been kind of irritated, and one of those people, yes, would have been the president, but those lives wouldn't have been lost, you know what I mean? So like the consequences of not following your instinct in one set of values versus the other was a lot more fatal, you know, which is why I think it's scary.
Yeah, and to think that people are making these life or death decisions in these ways,
Right.
and that these decisions have an, I mean, people making these decisions are building the bridges that we drive on and the buildings, the elevators that we ride in and so on.
Right.
This is among the many reasons why it's so important for engineers to have a strong sense of ethics, a strong sense of how to make these decisions, because we all depend on the engineers.
Mm-hmm. And like the average, like everyday non-engineer has to trust that engineers who are literally shaping their lives for them to live in are going to make the right decision, or the decision that they think is right anyway. Like, who's to say that it is quote unquote the right decision? But I mean, in this situation, everyone can kind of say with a clear conscience looking back, like, that was not the right decision, like, because 7 people died or however many people.
Yeah, that's right. That's also one of the reasons why we start with this example, because it's a little more straightforward.
It's a little more clear cut.
It also makes the engineers look pretty good. It doesn't seem like it's an engineering failure. It seems like it's a management failure. So the ethics here is not about how to make the right engineering decision. It's really about how to navigate the business, the politics of business. Yeah. We will look at some more difficult engineering challenges later.
More controversial.
Where the engineering decision isn't as straightforward. Deepwater Horizon case in particular, you'll see the back and forth exchange between the engineers, and they're really worried about trade-offs between time and money and effort. One thing, it'll take a long time, but it's a little more safe, but is that safety worth the additional cost it'll take? And there's maybe a little more of a decision-making process. But yeah, you're right. This one looks sort of clear in hindsight, so it's a good starter case. Hopefully, as you're thinking about these cases, you're also thinking about the cases that you would like to explore in your own research. Remember, you have a research project in weeks 10 and 11. We're only at week 2, so we have some time. But when we're going through these cases, start thinking about what aspects of the case you're most interested in. Is it the conflict with management? Is it the dilemma, the personal choice dilemma? Right, there's lots of aspects of these cases, and you probably want to search out your own research projects to focus on the issues that you're interested in. Not only that you're interested in, but also that you expect to encounter in your life. A lot of people like doing their research projects on like the Titanic or these old disasters, but for many of you, it's probably not going to be the case that you'll find yourself in a situation where you're engineering something Titanic-like, a big ship that could sink from an iceberg. So maybe that's not the most helpful thing for considering your future career. You might want to look for disasters that occur in your field related to things that you may be working on in the future. That's a little forward-looking suggestions. Any other comments? There's not a whole lot of people here, so I don't want to keep you all here. And again, you can come and go at any time. I've given you a secret word, so don't feel obligated to stay. The other major discussions that we have this lesson are the women in STEM. Why are you doing that? The women in STEM readings. Last year I had this AAUW report, but I just recently found this new NSF report from earlier this year, released in January of this year. It's a fascinating document. There's lots of really good information. A lot of this I go through in some detail in the lecture. I just want to say the issue of women in STEM fields and the very low participation of women in STEM fields, especially in things like computer science, where the trend is reversing, where there's fewer women in computer science today than there were just 10 years ago. These kinds of issues matter. The representation of different perspectives in these fields matters for how well the field does, for how well the field is able to meet our needs. I used in class today the example of, In airplanes, you have a little seat. Sometimes the seats are very small. Sometimes you don't have very much legroom. Imagine that only short people built airplanes, that the airplanes were all designed and built and manufactured by people who were generally pretty small. Those small people might find those chairs to entirely fit their needs, and that the airplanes made with chairs those size are entirely adequate. And if there are only small people making the planes, then maybe they never consider someone who's tall and who can't fit in that seat. Right? But if a tall person's around in the design process, they might notice right away that, oh, look, that seat doesn't fit me. That's not going to work for people my size.
Yeah, I'm 6'6". I need a big seat.
Yeah, and if a world is, most people are not 6'6", right? 6'6" is, I think that's 2 standard deviations outside of the average. So most people are not 6'6". A lot of people, very few people are 6'6", and so the world isn't created for people that are 6'6". And a lot of, yeah, I don't know if you want to say more about your experience.
No. Just I'm saying airplanes suck. Being this tall.
Right, and part of this is intentional, the airplane trying to save cost, but you might think that if there's a tall person participating in the design process, then they might influence it to not be as small, to make more accommodations for people who require bigger seats, more space. And the idea is that if there are no tall people in the design process, then all the short people building the plane might think it's perfectly adequate. And it's important to have these alternative perspectives early on in the process so that everyone's needs are met. If you don't have those perspectives in the design process, they don't end up in the technologies that you build. And the same analogy for tall people works for women. Women are half the population, but the things we design aren't designed typically with women in mind. And that means that just as you say that airplanes suck, well, if you're a woman, most of the world sucks because most of the world is not built for you. And it matters for the way we build things. So one of the examples I use, I don't know how good of an example this is, but is an example of pockets in women's clothing, the gender politics of pockets. And the gender politics of pockets is that women's clothing is usually not made with pockets. Right? Dresses and skirts tend to not have pockets. Jeans and pants, if they do have pockets, sometimes they're just cosmetic. You can't actually put anything in them. Or if you can put something in them, you can only put very small things in them. And you can't typically put a smartphone in the pockets of girl pants. And I mean, this is the problem, right? We're building these devices. Presumably everyone's going to wear these devices, but half the population, we make clothes for half the population that just simply doesn't accommodate these devices. And so it makes things just more difficult all around, right? If you don't have good pockets, I use my pockets all the time. I have things stuffed in my pockets all the time. If my clothes were not made for pockets, I would have a much harder time living. And this is the experience of women in the world. Things are just harder when they're not built for you. It works for tall people like that. It works for all identity categories like this. So I have a lot of readings about women in STEM. I talk about this a lot in the lecture. But the general point here is still this point about the scope of consideration. Who are we bringing into the process? Whose perspectives are we considering? Whose perspectives are we ignoring? And what is the impact that all that has on the things that we build? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts or comments that they want to add.
I don't know how true it is, but I was reading somewhere a while ago that a big reason that jeans started being made that way, and this is a little bit off topic, but a big reason that jeans started being made that way is to push women to buy handbags or other accessories to hold their stuff. And I don't know if there's any truth to that or if it's just, propaganda, but I heard it and I was like, I can't disagree with that statement. I can't disagree. That sounds logical to me.
Yeah, it forces them to accessorize and carry a purse and all that kind of stuff.
Which they also have to buy.
Right. It forces them into the whole gender role, the whole sort of package deal. Another part of this is it keeps them dependent. It keeps them sort of underpowered and dependent. Maybe a more extreme example of this are things like high heels. You can't really do anything in high heels. It's a way of compromising your ability. And I guess I don't know how obvious this is to people, but high heels is a kind of foot binding. This is a practice in some cultures of foot binding where they wrap tight bandages around the feet of young women, and it deforms their feet so that their feet are very, very small. And the idea is that very, very small feet are attractive, but it also means the women can't move around very fast. It almost cripples their feet, and there's all sorts of complications. Like they can't move very fast; they have to move very slowly there. And this is a way of keeping them underpowered and entirely dependent on the social system around them.
I think it's interesting too because like high heel shoes are considered like professional in a lot of situations. Like if a woman's going to, you know, a job interview, or if she works in an office, it's almost like expected that you're going to wear high heel shoes with whatever uniform you choose to wear, whether or not they're comfortable, whether or not they're practical, because it just looks professional, and that's what people perceive as professional. Even though that's not the case at all.
Yeah. I mean, right. So professional clothing for women is, it's uncomfortable, it's impractical, it's revealing. Right? Professional gear for men is suit and tie sort of across the board. There's not a lot of flexibility there, but that's pretty comfortable. It also keeps you warm in the winter, and it's if you have to go to a job every day and wear incredibly uncomfortable clothes and doing it, then you're going to be less likely to go into those jobs, right? This is part of the things that there's a steeper challenge. There's more things you have to do. It's harder. Yeah. And it's a continuation of these long-standing and extremely misogynist practices. Yeah. Good. Hey, Marissa, if you have more to say, please.
No, I was just spitballing.
Good. Let's see. So I don't know how much longer I want to stay here. I guess I'll just refer to the other readings. I don't think I went through them very closely in the lecture, but I have a few more readings from this lesson. A couple of readings from David Foster Wallace, who's an American novelist, nonfiction writer. He gives this speech to a commencement speech, a graduation ceremony at Kenyon College in 2005. And the upshot of the speech is about the importance of thinking, the importance of really paying attention to what you think. David Foster Wallace says, learning how to think really means learning how to exercise some control over how and what you think. It means being conscious and aware enough to choose what to pay attention to and choose how to construct meaning from experience. Because if you cannot exercise this kind of choice in adult life, you will be totally hosed. Learning how to think really means learning how to exercise some control over what you think. So earlier today in class, I was relating this to the Pewdiepie Scandal. I don't know if this matters to anyone, but Pewdiepie is this dude. He's a gamer and a streamer. He streams himself playing video games. And Pewdiepie, for the last 2 years, was the most he earned the most money as being an internet celebrity. So he was getting the most money from advertising dollars on his YouTube and Twitch streams. So he's making a ton of money over the last few years. He's also been in quite a few controversies because he spouts racist language. He, for a while, was in this trend of making Nazi jokes about everything. And for a while, he just kept making Nazi jokes. He was criticized for it a bunch, and he was like, but it's just a joke. It doesn't mean anything. And then advertisers started pulling money, started pulling their advertisements from his streams. And so he shaved up and he apologized. He's like, okay, I won't make Nazi jokes anymore. And then yesterday, he was playing a game. He was playing Player, he was playing Battlegrounds. And he was just in a fit of anger. He drops an N-bomb. He apologizes for it immediately, but he still drops the N-bomb in front of millions of people on YouTube. Now, again, people defending him, saying, look, he's not trying to be racist. He's not trying to be mean to anyone. He's not trying to, he's not being deliberately racist in the sense. He's just using a word out of anger. He's sort of caught up in the moment. Right? And this is what he says. He says that he was caught up in the moment, that he was just in a fit of anger. Says where he says, he says in the heat of the moment, he thought of the worst word he could possibly think of. And in some sense, this is understandable. When we're extremely angry, when we're passionate about something, we end up doing things that we might regret, that we might not fully mean, right? But this is David Foster Wallace's point, that it's easy to just do things and not think about what we're doing, right? To act impulsively in the heat of the moment. It's literally the easiest thing to do is to act on impulse. Right? You have these impulses. If you just act on whatever impulses you have, that's the path of least resistance. The much harder thing to do is to not act immediately on your impulses, but to stop and think about what you're doing and exercise control over what you're doing. Right? Pewdiepie had already been reprimanded and had lost a bunch of advertisers for saying racist shit online. And then, despite having been called on this a bunch, he still goes and drops an N-bomb just because he's angry. It's understandable that people do things they don't mean when they're angry, but people have an obligation also to control their anger, to control their actions, and to not do things like drop N-bombs in front of millions of people.
In my humble opinion, because I've obviously been paying attention to this for like a long time, like I think it's interesting. But if he is not capable of controlling his language and his speech in a supposed fit of rage, it just leads me to believe that he probably speaks somewhat like that on a normal basis, or thinks like that on a normal basis. Like that's a word that is commonly used in his vocabulary. Otherwise, why would it just like slip? Like in order for it to slip, it would have to mean that like it's a word that is normally in your vocabulary and you have to actively stop yourself from using it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's exactly right. So David Foster Wallace in his This Is Water speech, he talks about the natural default setting, the thing that we do without thinking about it. And it turns out that PewDiePie's natural default setting is to drop N-bombs when he's mad. And even if he's not meaning it in that moment in a negative way, the fact that that's part of his natural default setting is something that ought to concern us. It ought to, I think I said this in the introduction lecture, but I mean, it matters not just what we do when we mean it, but it also matters what we do when we're not thinking about it, right? So if when I get in a difficult situation, I tend to lie, even if the rest of the time I'm a truth teller, but when I get sort of cornered, I start lying and making stuff up. That makes me a liar, even if I mostly don't lie, even if I mostly tell the truth. But when the pressure's on, if I'm lying, that's what it means to be a liar, that when you revert to that kind of behavior. And you're right, it's an evidence of a lack of control. It's an evidence that maybe PewDiePie shouldn't have 1 million people watching him, because if he gets angry, he starts doing things that 1 million people shouldn't be watching.
Yeah, and I mean, whether or not you actually, put any weight on the word itself, like, doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is that a large percentage of the population does give a lot of weight to the word and is offended by the word. And he knows that. Like, he's not freaking stupid. Like, he has all these fans, all these followers. He's on social media all the time. Like, of course he knows. And he still apparently has a hard time you know, filtering himself and just removing that word from his vocabulary entirely. Like, whether or not you actually think that, whether or not you personally think that the word is offensive doesn't matter. Like, because it's not, you know, it's not your choice. It's not your call to make, you know what I mean? What offends people and what doesn't offend people.
Right. Yeah, and what I think the important thing is that what he's showing here is, I mean, there's possibly a way to use these words that is thoughtful and sensitive, possibly, but the fact that he's doing it as an impulsive thing shows that he's not thinking about it, and it's really the lack of thinking. It's really the lack of self-control that's the problematic part. It's the part that makes people want to get him off of the billion-person streams. Yeah. But even if we all agree that what he did is wrong, that he shouldn't have done these things, we can still at least recognize that it can be hard to make these choices. It can be hard to correct this behavior. Yeah. Especially if it's become your habitual response. If these words are embedded in your brain, it's hard to dig them out, to root them out. It's something that requires a lot of work, a lot of self-critical reflection. And that kind of reflection is very hard to do. It's the kind of reflection, people don't like to do self-critical work. People don't like, because, among other things, it requires understanding that you could be wrong, that you might have done something wrong, that you need to change, the kind of things. And people don't, that's hard to do. People don't like doing that.
Right.
Good. This has been a great conversation. Thank you very much, Marissa, for showing up.
No problem.
Yeah, so just in the last few minutes before I go, let me just say a few words about the remaining two readings. So this is the optional readings. I have another reading from David Foster Wallace. This is an article he wrote for Gourmet Magazine, which is a food, like a chef magazine. And David Foster Wallace goes to the Maine Lobster Fest. And he's not a vegetarian, but he's reflecting on all of these people boiling lobsters alive and then chowing down on them, and wondering if it's ethically permissible. And again, here the issue is the scope of ethical consideration. So normally when I eat, I'm just thinking about what I'm hungry for, what I want to eat. And I usually don't think about whether the way that I'm eating or what I'm eating is the right thing to eat. Again, David Foster Wallace is not a vegetarian. He's not advocating that people be vegetarians. What he's trying to do is just think carefully about what he's doing and what we're all doing when we're boiling lobsters alive to eat them. So I just want to zoom in here. So he's talking about the lobster fest. He compares it to a Roman circus or a medieval torture fest. He says, so my immediate reaction to this is that the comparison is hysterical, extreme. And yet the reason it seems extreme to me is that I believe the animals are less morally important than human beings. And when it comes to defending such a belief even to myself, I have to acknowledge that I have an obvious selfish interest in the belief since I like to eat certain kinds of animals and I want to keep doing it. And that I've not succeeded in working out any kind of personal ethical system in which this belief is truly defensible instead of just selfishly convenient. And this distinction between what's truly defensible and what's merely selfishly convenient, I think this is one of the hardest nuts to crack at the center of ethics, right? Being able to distinguish what I want for myself or what I think is right versus what's actually right, and trying to see how those two things can come apart, and that maybe what I want is not what's actually for the best. That's really, really hard. It takes, not only does it take working on yourself and correcting yourself, but in some sense it takes stepping outside of yourself and putting your own interests and values and desires on hold to try to appreciate the larger picture. And that's something that's almost impossible for people to do. It's at least really hard. It's almost impossible to do. Being able to distinguish what's right from what you want. But it's important. And then just extending this view out as far as it can go. Aldo Leopold was an environmentalist, a conservationist. in the mid part of the 20th century. And Leopold makes this argument that if you look at the history of ethics, what you see is an expanding scope, sort of a constantly expanding scope. 200 years ago, black people were slaves, but eventually slavery was ended, and eventually we extended rights and civil rights and human rights and so on to these people. So we went from a very narrow ethical concern to expanding that out. We did this not only for racial and ethnic minorities, but also for women and gay people and so on, right? It's sort of increasingly expanding scope. That doesn't mean that we've completed these tasks, right? There's still work to do in extending ethical consideration to others. But Leopold just notices this trend of increasingly expanding scope of consideration. And so he says, well, look, if this is the trend, why don't we just go to the ends of it? And the ends of it are to take ethical consideration beyond just the human and beyond even just the sensitive creatures, the creatures that can feel pain and pleasure, or the animals. Leopold wants to say that not only do the animals, do the sensitive creatures deserve ethical consideration, but so too do the insensitive, inanimate objects, things like the water and the soil and the carbon cycle. Right? The carbon cycle doesn't feel pain. A river does not feel pain. Right? There's no sensation of pain there. And if we think that ethics only extends to the things that feel pain, well, then maybe we don't need to consider the ethics of dealing with water or whatever. But our decisions have an impact on the water, on the soil, on the carbon cycle, and those things also have an impact on us. We're locked in a network of activity. And to think that our ethical consideration only applies to some limited portion of that network is a mistake. Leopold will say, no, we need to extend ethical consideration to encompass everything, to encompass it all, to encompass the land itself. This is the land ethic, right? In some ways, Leopold is trying to extend ethics as far as it can reach. Maybe he can go farther. I'll let you think about that or talk about that in your posts. Is it possible to push ethical consideration even further than Leopold does? But all of this is framed under this general question of scope of ethical consideration. What should the scope of ethics be? Who should be considered in the scope? I hope these readings, I hope some of this discussion helped you understand what's going on in the lesson. I've talked for an hour now. I think that's plenty. I don't know if you have any questions there, but I think I'm going to end the discussion here. Thank you for the people who contributed. If you want to come talk philosophy or have questions about the class, come next week to on the Hangout. It'll be next Wednesday at 1 o'clock, or at 12 o'clock again. All right, that's it. Thank you very much. See you next week.